Welcome back from the ad break, and let's continue with our lesson. So now we are going to go on to that second part, or the first part, sorry, of our concept map, and that is the input values. Now we are going to be looking at flow diagrams as well as tables, but remember, we are only focusing on those input values. So, input values. When we represent functions, we need to understand that there are two types of values involved: input values and output values. So what are these input values? Well, values that go in to an equation or a formula. This value can be represented using any variable. In functions, it is usually an x. So let's look at the formula there, or the equation that we have been given there. Y is equals to 2x plus 8. Now that x is the input value, and you remember what an input value is? It is the value that goes in to an equation or a formula or a rule. So if it's the one that goes in to an equation, the one that we insert, then it means that that is an input value. Let's look at how we can represent this, or how we can see this using our flow diagram and our table. So we already know what a flow diagram looks like, right? So here is one. It says they identify the input values and insert them into the table. So looking at this flow diagram there, of course we can see that this is an incomplete flow diagram, and the reason for that is because we are now focusing on our input values. So in our flow diagram, our input values would be the value that we are going to start with. It is the one that goes into the rule, and then that's the value that we are going to focus on. So even in our table, there is a space for our input value, and that is usually the first part of our table. So looking at that flow diagram there, we can see that we have three values that we have been given that are the input values. So we have a -6, we also have a -1, and of course we have an 11. So what is going to happen with those input values? Well, they are going to go into the rule, and then in the end we will get our result. But right now our focus is not getting the result, but just identifying those input values. So the first input value there that we have is the -6, and that of course will go into our table. The second input value that we have there is going to be the -1, and the third input value that we have there is the 11. Those are the input values that are going to go into the rule, and then we'll see what happens when we eventually are looking for that result. Let's move on to another flow diagram and see if we can identify the input values. Now, again, we are supposed to identify those input values and represent them in our table. Now, looking at this flow diagram, again, it is incomplete, but we can see that the rule that we are given there is to multiply by 7. So what number are we going to multiply by 7? That is the input value. Now, in this case, we have been given a -5 as the first input value. So that would be the one that goes first into our table, because we are now also representing our information in this table under or next to the input values, where the input values are supposed to go. The next input value is the -3. So remember, just as our rule is that multiply by 7, we need to put that into, or sorry, there is a specific value that needs to be multiplied by 7, and that value is the input value. So our second input value there is the -3. And then which one would be our last input value? That is going to be the 1. Again, the 1 is the number that is going to go into the rule, and then we are going to find a result. Let's move over to the next flow diagram. Now, looking at this flow diagram, again, we need to identify those input values. But as you can look at this flow diagram, we don't only have one part of a rule, but two parts. So whatever values that we are going to put in, they are going to be multiplied by 6, and then they are going to, or 3 is going to be subtracted from that product. So we can see which input values are we going to let this rule apply to? Yes, it is the -7. So a -7 is the one that is going to be multiplied by 6. And then from there, 3 is going to be subtracted from that product. And that is going to produce for us the result. But the input value, the number that was inserted in, is now that input value. What is the second input value that we have there? Yes, it is the -2. Now, -2 is the next number that's going to, yes, multiply by 6 and subtract 3 from that product. So that -2 is the next input value. Then looking at that last input value, that is going to be the 9. So again, the 9 will go through the same rule that the first two input values went through, and that is to multiply by 6 and have 3 subtracted from that product. Let's look at our last flow diagram where we are going to be looking at these input values. So this flow diagram again has 2 parts of an equation. A value is going to be divided by 2, and the answer we are going to add 8. So we're going to first divide a value by 2, and that quotient we are going to just add 8 onto it. But what values are we going to start with? So the actual values that are going to be divided by 2. Yes, those are the input values. So these are the values that we are going to put into our rule to get a result. So that first input value is a -12, of course. So that -12 is going to be divided by 2, and we are going to add 8. What about the second input value? Yes, that -6 is also going to go through the flow diagram to produce a result. And that last input value, yes, that is going to be the 20. So these are the input values that are presented to us. So now we need to see what happens to these input values after they go through that rule or formula in the middle. Let's quickly go to an ad break, and then we'll see you just now.